Welcome. The title of my presentation tonight is Kindred Spirits, Landscape Painting, Conservation, and National Parks. Now, I have an objective for this presentation, and this is the objective. By the time I'm through, you should be able to explain to me the significance of the title Kindred Spirits. So remember that, Kindred Spirits. I'm actually going to begin the presentation not at the beginning, but before the beginning. And that's because art and conservation have a long association that dates back to a time before there were national parks. In fact, some historians claim that it's difficult to understand the history of American conservation apart from the history of national parks. So tonight we're going to look at the long association between art, nature, conservation, and national parks, one of my loves, by focusing on the conservation legacy of a group of landscape painters led by a young English immigrant named Thomas Cole that came to be called the Hudson River School. How many people have heard of the Hudson River School? Okay, that's good. That's probably more people than have heard of me. So I'm going to I'll do just a little bit of introduction to myself. Posing here at Laurel's former park, Grand Teton. I was born in California, but grew up mostly in Western Washington, Oak Harbor, Redmond, Seattle, if you're familiar with any of those communities. And I earned my bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Washington before moving to the University of Illinois for my PhD.
ILL.
Yeah, the Fighting Illini. Yeah. I served for 35 years on the faculty at Texas A&M University, where I taught, as Laurel said, graduate and undergraduate courses in park and conservation policy. And for 8 of those years, my university actually agreed to let me work full-time in Washington, D.C. as the visiting chief social scientist for the National Park Service. Did a lot of things like visitor surveys and economic impact analyses and things like this for the National Park Service at that time. I retired from Texas A&M University in 2017. And my wife and I moved back to the Pacific Northwest, wanted to get back where the mountains were, and we've built a house in Redmond. So that's a little bit about me. Now on to the program here. Anybody familiar with Thomas Cole? Oh, okay, well, okay, I don't have to give the program. Beginning in the 1820s, when the United States was still a young country, and many people in America felt that their country was culturally inferior to the much older civilizations of Europe. A group of painters began painting the American landscape. They worked first in the Hudson River Valley north of New York City, and then in the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains of New York State, the Green Mountains of Vermont and the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and along the coast of Maine, in an area that is now Acadia National Park. Later, they would go to other parts of the country, even other parts of the world, in search of new landscapes to paint, but their cultural roots and their financial center remained in New York City. Their undisputed leader was Thomas Cole. Cole would help to lay the foundation for conservation as an American value, and he would become a catalyst for a nationalistic movement for landscape preservation that would eventually result in the creation of the first national parks as canonical examples of American scenery. Now, today, those of you who are familiar with national parks, and I assume some of you are, know that we regard them as much more than just scenery. They're parts of larger ecosystems that are unique. They're often irreplaceable. But this is an important point to remember. Without an appreciation for the aesthetic values of landscape, an appreciation promoted by the Hudson River School, the first national parks would not have been possible. To fully appreciate Thomas Cole's influence, we need to understand the American art scene in the early 19th century. When Cole and his family arrived from England in 1818, painting in the US was dominated by portraits and by historical themes, often copying European styles. Now, landscapes were not unknown in the US at that time, but they didn't attract much attention. So, if you were a starving artist and you wanted to become a well-fed artist, would you paint landscapes? No, that was not the path to prosperity. Thomas Cole would change that. We also need to understand early American views of wilderness. The predominant American attitude at the time viewed wild country as something to be subdued and exploited, or in the language of the day, to be improved. And in colonial America and the early United States, it was something to be feared. Thomas Cole and other artists of the Hudson River School would help change this exploitative and fearful view of wilderness into a positive one. Cole's presentation of nature slightly preceded, but was quite consistent with the later writings of such transcendentalists as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Or anybody familiar with the Transcendentalists? Oh, okay, wow, all right. Well, like the Transcendentalists, Cole believed that nature was imbued with strong spiritual significance. One could best understand God by immersing oneself in God's work. In other words, in the natural landscape. Or to put it another way, in the creation. The historian, I forgot his name. A historian points out another important reason that American audiences were receptive to the works of Thomas Cole. In the early 1800s, for the first time in American history, it was possible to live and even travel widely without ever coming into contact with wild country. People living in cities began to relate to nature as scenery, something that was restorative, something that was different from their everyday settings, and they traveled to see it. Some of the popular destinations early on were Niagara Falls and the Catskill Mountains. Accommodations catering to tourists were built, including the Catskill Mountain House, painted here. Do I have a point? Yeah, painted here by Thomas Cole. Now, Cole, in addition to being an artist, was also a poet and an essayist. And in one of his works titled Essay on American Scenery, he wrote that the scenery of Europe, decorated as it was with the ruins of the past, the Greek, the Roman, the medieval ruins, revealed the hand of the past. But the unspoiled scenery of the New World revealed the hope of the future. So this was an early expression of a patriotic stirring in the United States, centered on the American landscape. Initially, the natural landmark that most inspired American patriotism was Niagara Falls. Europe had nothing to compare. Here we see it painted by one of Thomas Cole's students, Frederic Church. We'll talk more about him later. But as America expanded westward, patriotic visions of landscape expanded with it. A national tableau unfolded of lofty mountain peaks rivaling the Alps, of steaming geysers and deep canyons and ancient sequoia trees that predated the birth of Christ. This excited the public imagination even more, and landscape painters, always interested in making a buck, rushed to capitalize on that excitement and to further fan it. American scenery became a symbol of American identity. Yes, Europe had the ruins of antiquity. They had the Greek temples. They had the Roman aqueducts. They had the medieval castles. But America had the deep and ancient architecture of the earth, what the historian Alfred Runte called earth monuments. And Many people consider those landscapes to be providential, to be the work of God, God showering his favors on the United States, showing that America the Beautiful was indeed a country on which God shed his grace. This is Mountain of the Holy Cross in Colorado, painted by Thomas Moran. We'll talk about more about him in a bit as well. One of the figures who inspired scenic patriotism in the United States was Thomas Cole. He was born in 1801 near Bolton, Lancashire, England, same town where a later painter, Thomas Moran, was born. At the age of 17, he emigrated to Philadelphia with his family and then on to Ohio, where his family operated a dry goods business. Now, while he was living in Ohio, Cole met a traveling portrait painter named John Stein. And Stein owned a book about famous artists that fascinated Cole. He studied it, and he aspired to become a famous artist himself. So he taught himself landscape painting, or portrait painting, excuse me. But he was never very good at this. At that time, there was no good art instruction in the US, and so as a result, Cole never learned to paint the human figure competently. He soon switched to landscapes. He was inspired by strolls in the forests around Pittsburgh, where he had relocated. And when he joined his family, which by that time had moved to New York City, he sold some early paintings to a New York art collector named George Bruin. Bruin encouraged Cole to paint the natural beauty of New York State. Now, at that time, in the infant art circle of the United States, several people were hoping that American artists would devote themselves to American landscape. So Bruin agreed to pay Cole's steamship fare up the Hudson River so he could try his hand at painting the scenery of the Hudson River Valley and the Catskill Mountains. And that's what Cole did. He spent part of the summer and fall of 1825 sketching in the Catskills. And when he returned to his family's apartment in New York City, he worked his sketches up into 3 finished oil paintings. Cole convinced the owner of a bookshop on Broadway to display his canvases in his shop's window. Now, one day they were seen by John Trumbull, who was the president of the American Academy of the Fine Arts. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he was a respected painter of historic themes who also dabbled in landscapes. Trumbull immediately bought Catskill Falls for $25. By the way, that falls is a New York State park right now. He showed his painting to William Dunlap, who was another artist and also the art critic for the New York Mirror. And while they were admiring it, they were joined by a third person, a young engraver who would later turn to landscape painting named Asher Durand. Trumbull took Dunlap and Durand back to the bookshop where Durand bought A View of Fort Putnam, and Dunlap bought Lake with Dead Trees, also for $25 each. Now, this was a tremendous turn of fortune for Thomas Cole. These men were the movers and shakers in the American art scene. It was said of John Trumbull that he knew virtually everyone in the United States who had a serious interest in art, and he wrote them letters encouraging them to commission works from Tom Cole, and the commissions did pour in. William Dunlap wrote glowing reviews in the New York Mirror and in other papers. Thomas Cole's fame spread in art circles, and the Hudson River School was launched. Although interestingly, it would not be known by that name until decades after Cole's death. Thomas Cole's paintings were heavily influenced by European theories of aesthetics, including those of his contemporary, the English artist and art critic, John Ruskin. Ruskin wrote that the principal duty of artists was what he called truth to nature. In other words, artists should paint landscapes and nature as it really was, and not rely on tired conventions of the time that had been invented to portray sky and clouds and water and such things. Now, according to the taxonomy of the day, nature could be divided into three categories: the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. The beautiful was cultivated nature, showing humans' civilizing influence, farms, pastures, rural villages, and so. Initially, the picturesque was any nature fit to be in a picture. But over time, it became nature associated with historic culture through ruins of antiquity and other signs, historic signs that were scattered all over the landscape of Europe. The picturesque was enormously popular. Many landowners in England designed landscapes on their estates that included prefabricated remains of Greek temples. And when John Ruskin was invited to visit the United States, he declined the invitation, saying he could not, even for a couple of months, live in a country so miserable as to possess no castles. Finally, the sublime represented the greatness and power of God and the insignificance of humankind. In painting, it was best shown by wild, uncultivated nature, inspiring awe or fear. Storms, for example. It was a manifestation of God on earth. Cole embraced the sublime and frequently represented it in his landscape paintings. For example, in keeping with the wildness of the sublime, Cole minimized human influence in his paintings. In this early sketch, we see the roof of a tourist pavilion and an observation platform on the top of the falls. Cole edited these out of his finished painting. He turned them into rocks, actually. And he added a storm, which is another nod to the sublime. Now, in what became a convention of the Hudson River School, people were depicted with ant-like dimensions. Now, in part, this was because painting the human figure would be a struggle for Thomas Cole all of his life, so people were actually best viewed at a distance. But it also represented the humbleness of humans before the sublime presence of God in nature. If people were shown at all, they were often American Indians, indicating that this landscape was true to the nature that existed prior to European colonization. Finally, storm-blasted trees in the foreground framed the picture and represented nature's cycle of life and death. This became another convention of the Hudson River School. In 1844, when Thomas Cole was at the height of his fame, he explored a remote fishing island off the coast of Maine. Now today, Mount Desert Island makes up the major part of Acadia National Park. How many have been to Acadia? Yeah, okay. But in Cole's time, it was unknown to most people who lived in the cities of the Northeast. It was sparsely settled. Much of it was still wilderness. It was difficult to reach. There was no regular transportation to it. Cole got there on a fishing boat. And it certainly was not the tourist mecca that it became in the decades after Cole's visit. While on Mount Desert, Cole made several sketches, some of which he worked up into finished paintings back at his studio in New York. Cole exhibited one of these paintings, View Across Frenchman's Bay After a Squall, at the New York Academy of Design in 1845. This was the most prestigious exhibition venue in the US at that time, and Cole's painting did two things. First, it introduced the scenery of Mount Desert to an island, a population, that had both the wealth and the leisure to travel. And second, other artists saw Cole's painting, and always on the lookout for fresh material, they were inspired to follow in his footsteps. Their later works further enhanced Mount Desert's reputation as a place to enjoy wild scenery. So it's not stretching matters to say too much that this painting, done in 1845, triggered a historical trajectory that would eventually result in Congress establishing a national park on Mount Desert Island in 1919. And that was the first national park east of the Mississippi. And according to some historians, the last national park established primarily for its scenic values as opposed to its scientific values. An 1872 article in Harper's Magazine put it this way: Cole was a pioneer here, as he was in our landscape art, and he had a host of followers. Most all of the noted artists have followed, and it is chiefly by this means that Mount Desert has become so popular. Now, most of the visitors to Mount Desert, even the prosaic folks, go prepared to enjoy the picturesque, the beautiful, the sublime. The art historian Richard Hughes draws an interesting comparison between the two premier painters of the American natural scene in the early 19th century, Thomas Cole and John James Audubon. Audubon was more technically accomplished than Cole, but he never had disciples, other artists who gravitated to him and embraced his vision and advanced it. But Cole's legacy is continuous. His conservation legacy is the Hudson River School and its celebration of the American landscape. This was a group of like-minded artists who were active for over 50 years, into the 1870s and beyond, and who continue to be popular today. Cole's conservation legacy was his promotion through his art, through his essays, and through his poetry of America as a nation inextricably tied to nature. Cole invited all Americans to consider conservation as a national value. On the porch of Cedar Grove, Cole's home and studio in Catskill, New York, there's an exhibit that shows a view of the Catskill Mountains and includes 3 lines from a Thomas Cole poem that literally invite us to nature. Friends of my heart, lovers of nature's work, let me transport you to those wild blue mountains that rear their summits over the Hudson's waves. Let's look at Thomas Cole's legacy. In 1844, a Connecticut art collector named Daniel Wadsworth persuaded Cole to take on his first student. Cole didn't like to have students, but Wadsworth persuaded him to take on Frederic Church. Frederic Church was 18 years old at the time, lived in Hartford, was an aspiring artist who demonstrated some talent, and actually during his career he achieved enormous fame, enormous wealth. In today's language, we might call him a rock star, although if any of you watch the Super Bowl, you know we're not supposed to use that term anymore. And he is the Hudson River painter most closely associated with Mount Desert Island. He made his first visit in 1850, and between then and 1862, he returned at least 6 times. In fact, when the Agamont Hotel opened on Mount Desert Island in 1855 as the first hotel in Bar Harbor, the first name on the guest register was Frederic Church, who was traveling with another Hudson River artist, John Kensett. Coast scene, Mount Desert, painted in 1863, is Frederic Church's most powerful painting of the Acadia region. Now, Church, who was a devout Calvinist, had learned from Cole, who was an Episcopalian, that painting should have multiple meanings, including a strong moral message. On the surface, Coast Scene is a dramatic seascape and a popular tourist destination. But art historians see strong moral content in this painting as well. What was going on in 1863 in the United States? The Civil War. There were draft riots in New York, other northern cities. It was a time of great division and conflict, not only between the North and the South, but in the North. Given this, a common interpretation of Coast Scene is it represents New England as the bedrock of the Union, withstanding repeated assaults while being watched over by a transcendent power. In keeping with that interpretation, Frederic Church incorporates two allegorical devices he learned from Thomas Cole: the cruciform and emblematic personification. Both Church and Cole frequently use the refracted rays of the sun to form a cross in the sky, symbolizing the presence of God in heaven, in this case, watching over the earthly struggle. And both artists frequently overlaid rugged profiles of heads and faces on rocks, personifying them. This drove home the transcendental message that even inanimate nature was possessed of spiritual vitality. Now I'm watching you, and I can see some of you are thinking, well, that speaker has an active imagination. But if we look at an earlier sketch by Frederic Church, we can see the use of emblematic personification quite clearly. In this sketch of the Mount Desert coast, we see a face on the cliff. Church's handwritten note calls it a face, and he darkens it with his pencil to emphasize it. Emblematic personification. Sanford Gifford was part of the second generation of Hudson River artists. In 1864-65, he made this painting, this view of Otter Cove from the summit of Cadillac Mountain on Mount Desert Island. It's his best known painting of the Acadia region. Now I'm including it here because to me, this painting symbolizes one of the bedrock principles of American conservation, that of intergenerational equity. The principle of intergenerational equity says that generations living today have a responsibility to protect landscapes like this, unimpaired, for the enjoyment of future generations. That principle is written into the law that created the National Park Service in 1916. Today, visitors to Acadia National Park can stand in the same place Sanford Gifford stood when he made this painting and see essentially the same view that Sanford Gifford saw over 150 years ago. There are changes of course, certainly around the boundary of the park for those of you who have been there, but also in things like air chemistry and water chemistry that are less evident. So to me, this painting symbolizes not only the hope and promise of intergenerational equity, but the challenges we face in trying to preserve landscapes like this that have been impacted and that can change over time because they're dynamic, but to preserve them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Hunter Mountain Twilight is another one of Sanford Gifford's best known paintings, and according to some art historians, one of the most important American landscapes of the 19th century. It shows a deforested, desolate Adirondack scene. This is an area where Sanford Gifford grew up. And it's a little different from the normal celebrations of nature that we see from Hudson River painters. Now, ironically, one of Gifford's most important patrons, one of his most important patrons was a timber baron named James Pinchot, whose family was responsible for many scenes like this. But Pinchot had done an about-face and become an advocate for a new type of scientific forestry in the United States. He helped to endow the first school of forestry in the US at Yale University, and he donated the land for its summer field school, where Aldo Leopold, among other people, studied. He also bought Hunter Mountain Twilight from Sanford Gifford, and it hung in an honored place over the mantel in his home for decades as a cautionary reminder of the destructive logging practices of the past. When James Pinchot had a son, he asked Sanford Gifford to be his godfather, and he named that boy after the artist. That son, you got it, Gifford Pinchot, went on to become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service when it was established in 1905, and one of America's pioneering conservationists. And he inherited Hunter Mountain Twilight. Today it's in a museum in Chicago. Okay, moving right along here. In 1862, Albert Bierstadt, another Hudson River artist, saw photographs in a New York gallery taken by the pioneering landscape photographer Carleton Watkins. Is anybody familiar with Carleton Watkins? Okay, an overlooked figure, a giant, yeah, okay. That same year, Albert Bierstadt made the first of 3 grueling transcontinental trips to Yosemite Valley. And his numerous oil paintings resulting from those trips became the first large-scale color views of Yosemite Valley seen in the East, and are credited with establishing the valley as a serious artistic subject. For those of you who know this, it's a strong tradition that continues to this very day. Now, in 1864, the federal government transferred the Yosemite Valley to the state of California with the stipulation that it be protected as a nature preserve for all time. This is generally regarded as the first expression of the national park idea in the United States. But it was a highly unusual action. It was coming at a time when the federal government was actually opening up public land to settlement and development under the Homestead Act and other legislation. So to withdraw land from settlement in order to protect it as a park was unheard of. None other than Frederic Law Olmsted, who wrote the first master plan for Yosemite Valley, credited the paintings of Bierstadt and the photographs of Watkins with preparing the American public to accept what at that time was an unprecedented federal action. And after all, after seeing a Bierstadt painting of Yosemite Valley, who wouldn't want to protect it? Years later, the state of California returned the valley to the federal government so that it could be added to the surrounding Yosemite National Park, which Congress had created in 1890. In 1871, the artist Thomas Moran accompanied the geologist and explorer Ferdinand Hayden on the first scientific survey of what was to become Yellowstone National Park, which at that time was largely unknown territory. Hayden showed Moran's watercolors of the region to members of Congress, and by some accounts, even to the President of the United States during the debate over the Yellowstone Bill in 1872. And along with the black and white photographs of William Henry Jackson, those paintings are credited with helping ensure the passage of the bill, which established Yellowstone as the nation's first national park. Now, later that year, Moran completed a monumental oil painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. It measures 12 feet by 7 feet. Congress purchased this painting for $10,000, and it became the first landscape to hang in the U.S. Capitol. You can see it today in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. Moran would go on to paint at least 8 other areas that became national parks. And those included areas like Zion, Arizona's Grand Canyon, Grand Teton. Because of his role in popularizing those landscapes, in the 1930s, the National Park Service described Thomas Moran as the father of the national park system. Now, that might be a tiny bit of hyperbole, but Moran became one of a select group of artists to have his name permanently inscribed on the American landscape. In 1872, Ferdinand Hayden named a prominent peak in the Teton Range after the artist, Mount Moran. I have to credit my wife, Jacqueline. I have to credit her with the dramatic lightning strike photo. We were actually married in Grand Teton, and we'll be back there later this year to celebrate our 50th anniversary. Chasm of the Colorado was Thomas Moran's first painting of Arizona's Grand Canyon. Now, Moran actually ended up painting more views of Grand Canyon than he did of Yellowstone. But curiously, In his first paintings of the Grand Canyon, he ignored one of its most striking features, its stratigraphy, in favor of a stormy interpretation. Now, Moran, like many early travelers to the desert Southwest, he really struggled to make sense of a landscape that defied conventional notions of scenic beauty. In fact, many early travelers and tourists did not consider the Grand Canyon or the surrounding desert to be scenic at all. They described it with terms like desolate, terrifying, the grave of the world. Moran solved his particular struggle by portraying the Grand Canyon not as beautiful, not as picturesque, but as sublime. Not as beautiful, not as picturesque, but as sublime. Grafton Tyler Brown was born in 1841 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He apprenticed with a printer and learned lithography. He moved to California as a young man and worked for a few years as a lithographer and a cartographer, a map maker in San Francisco. This bird's eye map of Virginia City, Nevada is one of Grafton Tyler Brown's maps. But Grafton Tyler Brown also painted, and he became the first African-American professional painter to work on the West Coast, and one of the very few black landscape painters in all of the United States in the 1920s. Brown eventually gave up map making to devote all of his time to his painting. He traveled all over the Pacific Northwest and beyond, and settled in Portland in 1885 at a time when the state's constitution prohibited blacks from living in Oregon. But he was light-skinned, managed to pass for white, and became prominent in Northwest art circles. He helped form the Portland Art Society, for example. One of Brown's favorite landscape subjects was Yellowstone National Park. Now, because he had worked he had learned photography, he had worked professionally in that field, many of his paintings display what looks like a map maker's attention to detail. But he also developed a distinctive style that became a little less literal, a little less true to nature. And this is probably because of his interaction with other artists in the Portland area. So what we begin to see in Grafton Tyler Brown's work is the emergence of a trend towards modernism that would propel American landscape painting into the 20th century. Oh, I see, yeah. What happened? Yeah. There we go, thank you. Thank you, Laura. So anyway, we see this trend towards modernism that would bring landscape painting into the next century and beyond. Now, the 19th century is considered the golden age of landscape painting in the US. And it's true that as the nation entered the 20th century, many in the art world turned away from landscape in favor of urban scenes and abstraction and pop art. But landscape painting didn't go away. It adapted, and new contemporary modern styles of landscape painting emerged. At Grand Canyon National Park, examples include the pastel and ink drawings of Joseph Yoakum, another black artist, the passionate palette of Serena Suplee. Those are her words, not mine. The passionate palette of Serena Suplee, and the angularity of Ed Mill. But even modern landscape painters owe a singular debt to Thomas Cole and the Hudson River School. So why do we protect areas like national parks? Well, one reason I mentioned earlier is scenic beauty. Park enthusiasts may not fully understand the ecological or the scientific values of a park. They may not see the handiwork of a higher power in that park, but they do enjoy scenery. Now, for some parks, like desert parks, especially like Death Valley, this required a gradual expansion in the social definition of scenery over time. Stark beauty, stark scenery. And for a park like Everglades, this meant finally embracing it for its scientific and its ecological values as a river of grass, despite its lack of conventional or traditional scenic values. But our attraction to nature may have deeper roots in our evolution as a species over eons of time. We are, after all, a product of the planet on which we evolved. Scientists call our innate attraction to the planet's nature biophilia. This was a term popularized by the late conservation biologist E.O. Wilson. According to Wilson, biophilia is a genetic tendency to affiliate emotionally with other living organisms through what he called biased learning. In other words, as we evolved as a species, we learned to prefer and to seek out those aspects of the natural world that promise comfort and survival value, such as flowering plants and green vegetation and so on. Now, like other genetic traits, biophilia may be expressed less in some individuals than in others, but according to Wilson, the potential lies in all of us as human beings. The biophilia hypothesis states that our attraction to the planet's nature, rather than being a product of whimsy or taste, expresses a fundamental human need. There's been much research testing this hypothesis around the world. Results from studies both in laboratory settings and field settings include the following. Nature, natural settings, unthreatening nature especially, is preferred over built environments across a wide variety of cultures. It reduces physiological indicators of stress, such as blood pressure. It induces a state of wakeful relaxation through increased alpha wave activity in the brain. It assists in healing after surgery, and it promotes positive psychological states, such as pleasure and enjoyment. So biophilia links us physiologically and psychologically to the nature in parks, to the nature we photograph, to the nature we visit, to the nature we write about, to the nature we conserve, and to the nature we paint. Let's conclude by closing the circle. On February 6, 1848, after attending services at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Catskill, New York, Thomas Cole complained of fatigue and discomfort. His condition rapidly worsened, and a doctor was summoned. But on February 11, 1848, at the age of 47, Thomas Cole succumbed to what was apparently pleurisy. He was survived by his wife Mariah, by 2 daughters, a son, and a yet-to-be-born son, Thomas Cole Jr. And he was survived by the Hudson River School. A New York art collector asked Thomas Cole's old friend and fellow artist, Asher Durand, to paint a tribute to Cole. Durand titled his painting, Kindred Spirits. And it shows Thomas Cole on the right and his friend, the editor and nature poet, William Cullen Bryant, in a composite New York Hudson River Valley landscape, which includes Catskill Falls. Cole is holding a portfolio of sketches and appears to be instructing Bryant on some point of nature. This painting remained in the Bryant family until 1904, when William Cullen Bryant's daughter donated it to the New York Public Library. Now, by 1904, the artists of the Hudson River School were virtually forgotten. Many of their works were lost. It was said at this time that the value of a Hudson River School painting was no more than the value of the canvas on which it was done. But after World War II, and especially in the 1960s, if you remember the 1960s, interest in the Hudson River School revived. And in 2005, in order to increase its endowment, the New York Public Library offered kindred spirits for sale at silent auction. The winning bid was $35 million, which at that time was the highest amount ever paid for a painting by a 19th century American artist. The winning bidder was the Walton Family Foundation, that's Walmart, for its new Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, which opened in Bentonville, Arkansas in 2011. So the Hudson River School is back. We are enriched by its revival, by its massive contribution to conservation, and by the continuing legacy of Thomas Cole. Thank you. Yeah.